The crack of the rifle was a thunderclap in the Wyoming silence. Dust and splinters exploded from the stagecoach's frame. Inside, the world became a symphony of chaos, the shriek of a woman, the terrified cry of a child, and the splintering groan of wood as the coach lurched violently, its lead horses shot dead. Elias Vance, a passenger just moments before, was already moving. Instinct honed over a decade, wearing the star of a U.S. Marshal, overrode thought. He shoved the man beside him to the floorboards. "Stay down." His hand was already inside his coat, fingers closing around the cold, familiar grip of his Colt. The coach slewed sideways, threatening to tip, and came to a grinding halt in a cloud of red dust. Elias peered through the shattered window. 4 riders, their faces masked by bandanas, circled them like vultures. Their leader, a tall man on a powerful black stallion, sat motionless, watching the panic with an unnerving calm. He wore a fine duster, strangely clean, amidst the grime, and held his pistol with the ease of a master craftsman. The lockbox, the man's voice cut through the air, sharp and educated, devoid of the usual ruffian's growl. "Send it out, and the rest of you may live to see another sunrise." The driver, a brave fool named Henderson, leveled his shotgun over the side. "You'll get lead before you get this company's property." The leader sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. He raised his pistol, a fluid motion of chilling grace, and fired. Henderson crumpled without a sound, his shotgun clattering to the ground. Elias's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary stick-up. This was an execution. "My God," a woman, and whispered from the corner of the coach. She was young, clutching a small child to her chest. Her eyes, wide with terror, met Elias's. He saw his own wife Sarah in that look, the same fear, the same desperate plea for protection he had failed to provide 2 years prior. The memory was a hot brand on his soul. He would not fail again. He kicked open the opposite door, using it as a shield as he dropped to the ground. Dust choked him. Gunfire echoed. He fired back. His shot was precise, aimed to disable, not kill. One of the riders cried out, clutching his shoulder as his horse shied. Elias used the moment to scramble for better cover behind a rocky outcrop. He was a marshal no longer. He'd turned in his badge the day he buried Sarah, but the training was bone deep. Another bandit fired the bullet, whining past Elias's ear and ricocheting off the rock. Elias returned fire, the concussive blasts of his Colt, a familiar, terrible rhythm. The bandits were disorganized, now their leader's cold command, broken by Elias's sudden professional resistance. They were thugs, not soldiers, but their leader was different. He dismounted, moving with a predator's confidence, his pistol never wavering. Elias saw his chance. One of the bandits was reloading, his side exposed. Elias took aim, his sight picture perfect. He squeezed the trigger. At that exact moment, the young mother, desperate to shield her child, scrambled out of the coach on the far side directly into the line of fire. Elias saw her a fraction of a second too late. The world slowed to a crawl. He saw the flash from his own muzzle, the puff of dust on the woman's simple gray dress, the look of stunned disbelief on her face before she collapsed. A guttural sound of horror tore from Elias's throat. The bandits, seeing their opening, grabbed the lockbox from the driver's seat. As they fled, one of them fumbled, dropping a small object that glinted in the harsh sunlight. It was a silver locket on a fine chain. Sarah's locket. The one she was wearing the day she died, stolen by the men who had left her on a cold, empty road. The bandits vanished over the rise, their charismatic leader the last to disappear, his silhouette framed against the unforgiving sky. The world fell silent again, broken only by the whimpering of the child beside her mother's still form, and the ragged, agonizing sound of Elias Vance's own breathing. He knelt in the dust, the smoking pistol falling from his numb fingers. He reached out his hand, trembling, and picked up the locket. It was warm from the sun. He had failed again. He had become the very thing he hunted. He was not a protector. He was a killer, and his justice had just orphaned a child. 5 years later, the Wyoming wind was a razor-stripping warmth from bone and soul alike. It howled across the vast, empty plains surrounding the Turner Ranch, a place built not for comfort, but for endurance. The man known as Jacob Turner stood on his porch watching the bruised purple of dusk bleed into the horizon. Red dust, fine as flour, settled in the creases of his eyes, a constant reminder of the unforgiving earth he had chosen for his exile. He was Elias Vance no more. That man had died in the dust of the stagecoach road, his name buried along with his badge. Jacob Turner was a ghost, a reclusive rancher with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a guilty past and eyes as cold and empty as the winter landscape. A small hand slipped into his. "Papa, are you sad?" He looked down at Lily, the child from the stagecoach. She was 6 now, her hair the color of sun-cured hay, her eyes holding a startling, innocent clarity. He had raised her as his own, the only penance he could offer for the life he had taken. Every time he looked at her, he saw the mother he had killed. It was a pain he welcomed, a daily flagellation for his soul. "Just thinking, Lilybug," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. He had built this ranch on a foundation of silence. His 2 hands, an old-timer named Jed, and a younger man Ben knew not to ask questions. They respected his work ethic and feared the bleak stillness that surrounded him. The house was a fortress against the world and against the warmth of human connection. But Lily was growing. She needed more than a silent man and the rough company of ranch hands. She needed a woman's touch, a teacher, a gentler voice. It was a need that clawed at him, another failure he could not abide. The letter had been sent to a church aid society in Cheyenne. His request blunt and impersonal: cook and tutor needed for a child. Room and board provided. Pay is fair. Inquire if you are resilient and expect little else. He hadn't expected a reply, but one had come. A woman named Clara May was arriving on the afternoon train. The sound of the wagon returning from Bitter Creek Station pulled him from his reverie. He watched as a woman stepped down, her movements measured and graceful despite the clumsy patched wool dress she wore. She was not what he had expected. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a resilience in the straight line of her back as she paid the driver. She carried a single wooden suitcase, its hinge tied with twine, and held her head high against the biting wind. She walked toward the house, her gaze taking in the stark functionality of the place without judgment. When she reached the porch, her eyes, a deep and steady brown, met his. They held no fear, only a profound weariness and a flicker of something else, determination. "Mr. Turner," her voice was low and clear without the quaver he had anticipated. He nodded, his arms crossed over his chest, a barricade against intrusion. "The work is hard. The winters are harder. The child is quiet." "I am no stranger to hardship, sir," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "And I am fond of quiet." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. He was measuring her, trying to find the flaw that would allow him to send her away, to retreat back into his self-imposed isolation. But he found none. There was only a woman who looked as if she had weathered her own storms and was still standing. "The kitchen is through there," he said at last, his voice clipped. "Your room is the small one off the pantry. Supper is at 6. He turned and walked away, without another word, leaving her alone on the porch. He felt her eyes on his back, a sensation as foreign and unsettling as a warm breeze in January. Inside the house, Lily peeked around the corner of the doorway, her ragdoll clutched to her chest. She watched the woman on the porch, her expression a mixture of curiosity and a deep, unspoken hope. Jacob Turner felt a tightening in his chest. He had just invited the world back into his fortress, and he was terrified it would expose the ruins within. The house settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Clara May moved through it with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and unnerving to Elias. kitchen, once a place of mere function, smelling of smoke and dust, slowly transformed. The scent of baking bread began to replace the cold sterility. She mended torn curtains he hadn't noticed were torn, her stitches small and perfect. She scrubbed the soot-stained walls behind the stove until hints of the original pale wood showed through. She did not decorate or add frills. She simply brought order and a subtle warmth, a life that had been absent for 5 long years. Lily was her shadow. The little girl who had been as silent as Elias was now a bubbling spring of questions and stories. She would perch on a stool in the kitchen watching Clara knead dough, her small voice filling the space. "Tell me a story," she would ask, and Clara would weave tales of faraway places, of brave animals and clever children, her voice a soft, steady melody against the constant moan of the wind outside. Elias observed it all from a distance. He would pass the kitchen doorway and hear Lily's laughter, a sound so rare it felt like a physical blow, and his stride would slow. He'd see Clara, a dusting of flour on her cheek, smiling down at the child, and a complicated emotion would twist in his gut. It was a relief so profound, it felt like pain. He was grateful, and he resented his gratitude. Every smile on Lily's face was a testament to his own failure as a father. The nights remained his domain of silence. He would sit on the porch, nursing a bottle of whiskey, the cold burning a welcome path down his throat, while Clara sat by the kitchen stove mending. They existed in separate orbits, their silence a fragile truce. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of rounding up stray cattle in the high country, Elias carried a sleeping Lily up the stairs. He tucked the quilt around her, his calloused hand gentle as he brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Good night, Lilybug," he murmured. A pause, and then a small, sleepy voice drifted from the pillow. "Papa, can she tuck me in too?" The word struck Elias like a physical blow. He froze, his hand hovering over the quilt. He looked down at his daughter, her eyes half open, but filled with a longing so deep and pure, it was like looking into the sun. It was the hunger for a mother's touch, a need he could never, ever fulfill. His chest tightened until he could barely draw breath. He had built this entire life, this lie, to protect her, to atone for her loss. And yet the one thing she wanted was the one thing he could never give her. "She's only here to cook, Lily." He said, his voice flat, and clipped the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was trying to deny the child, to deny the truth stirring inside him, that this woman was becoming more than an employee. She was becoming a necessity. Lily's face fell, a shadow passing over her features, and she turned her head into the pillow without another word. Downstairs, Clara had been on her way up with a stack of freshly folded linens. She had heard every word. The rejection wasn't meant for her yet. It burned with a familiar sting. She stood motionless on the stairs, and the linens clutched to her chest until she heard Elias's heavy footsteps move away from the bedroom. Quietly, she retreated to the kitchen, the warmth of the stove offering little comfort against the sudden chill that had settled in her heart. "She's only here to cook." The words echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of her place, of every place she'd ever been, temporary, functional, and ultimately alone. Later, from his post on the porch, Elias heard a soft sound from inside. It was Clara humming a low, sad tune as she worked. The melody drifted out into the cold, dark night, a thread of quiet sorrow that wrapped around his heart and squeezed. For the first time, he wondered about the storms she had weathered alone, and he felt a flicker of something other than guilt. It was a nascent, terrifying kinship. The first riders came at noon when the sun was a white, unforgiving glare in the sky. There were 3 of them, and they didn't ride like cowboys. They moved with a taut, predatory stillness, their horses cutting through the dust with an unnatural quiet. They stopped just beyond the fence line, their leader, a burly man with a scar that cleaved his left eyebrow in 2. Elias had been repairing a harness on the porch. He didn't stop his work, but his movements became more deliberate, every sense on high alert. He felt Clara and Lily watching from the kitchen window. Jacob Turner, the scarred man, called out his voice, laced with a false congeniality. Elias drove the awl through the thick leather before looking up. He didn't answer, letting the silence hang. My employer, Mr. Kane, has taken an interest in this valley. The man continued undeterred. He's buying up properties. He's authorized me to make you a generous offer for this plot and its water rights. The Sweetwater Creek is the lifeblood of this territory, as you know. It's not for sale, Elias said. His voice was flat final. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Everyone has a price, Turner. Mr. Kane is a very persuasive man. He understands that sometimes a man needs convincing to see what's in his own best interest. He let his gaze drift pointedly toward the house where the curtain had just twitched. The threat was as clear as if he'd drawn his gun. You and your employer can go to hell, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He went back to his harness, his dismissal absolute. The scarred man's smile vanished. He exchanged a look with his men, then wheeled his horse around. You'll regret this, he called over his shoulder. Silas Kane always gets what he wants. The name hit Elias like a physical shock. Kane. A common enough name, but coupled with the man's unnerving confidence and the professional menace of his men, it lit a fuse of unease in the deepest part of his memory. He watched them ride off their backs straight, leaving a trail of dust and silent menace. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, his Colt resting on the table beside him, the cold steel a grim comfort. He listened to the house settle, to the soft breathing of Lily from her room upstairs, to the quiet rustle of Clara moving in her small room off the pantry. He had brought them here to this isolated patch of land to keep them safe. But the world and his past had found him. The name Kane was a ghost rattling the door, and he knew this was only the beginning. He was no longer just a rancher defending his land. He was a man with a secret, and the wolves were sniffing at his trail. A week later, the water from the kitchen pump ran cloudy, carrying a bitter chemical taste. Jed, his face grim, confirmed Elias's suspicion. Someone dumped a sack of lye down the well, boss. It's poisoned. Good thing we got the creek for the stock, but the house, well, it's done for. Rage cold and pure surged through Elias. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was an act of war. It was personal. It was designed to make them suffer. While Jed and Ben worked on a plan to run a temporary pipe from the creek, Elias saddled his horse. Where are you going? Clara asked, standing in the doorway of the barn. Her hands were twisting a dishcloth, but her eyes were steady. To find who did this, he said, his voice clipped. He checked the load in his rifle, the familiar weight, a grim reassurance. You can't go alone, she insisted. They'll be waiting for you. This isn't your concern. The words were harsher than he intended, a reflexive defense to push her away to keep her safe. Her chin lifted. Lily is my concern. This ranch is my concern. And you, Mr. Turner, are acting like a fool. You are one man against who knows how many. Let me at least go to town, speak to the sheriff. The sheriff in Bitter Creek is on Kane's payroll, or too scared to be of any use. Elias retorted, swinging into the saddle. He looked down at her, at the fierce determination in her face, and his resolve wavered for a fraction of a second. Bar the doors. Keep Lily inside. Don't let anyone in until I get back. He rode out, not toward Kane's sprawling empire to the east, but into the broken, rocky canyons to the north. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was hunting. The marshal in him, buried for 5 years, was awake and hungry. He moved with a silent purpose, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the subtle language of broken twigs, disturbed stones, and hoofprints. He found their camp before dusk. It was tucked into a box canyon, well hidden and defensible. Two men, the same two who had accompanied the scarred man, were tending a fire. Elias tethered his horse and crept forward on foot, moving like a shadow through the sagebrush. He watched them for an hour, his mind a cold, calculating machine. They were professionals, disciplined and alert. This was more than a land grab. This was an operation. As darkness fell, he slipped closer. He needed proof, something to connect them to Cain, something more than a name. While one of the men went to check on the horses, Elias saw his chance. He moved with a speed that belied his size, a ghost in the firelight. He scanned the camp, his eyes cataloging every detail. His gaze fell on a saddlebag, carelessly left open. Tucked inside was a small, hand-carved object, a bullet casing whittled into the shape of a wolf's head. Elias froze. His blood turned to ice. He had seen a casing like that only once before, pulled from the wooden frame of a stagecoach 5 years ago. It was the signature of a particular gunsmith who worked exclusively for one of the most ruthless outlaw gangs in the territory. A gang that had been led by a charismatic, educated man who had vanished after that final bloody robbery. He retreated back into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't just the land. It wasn't just a random act of intimidation. Silas Cain wasn't just a wealthy rancher. He was the man from the stagecoach. The man who had dropped Sarah's locket. The man who had orchestrated the event that had shattered Elias's life and led to the death of Lily's mother. And somehow, impossibly, he was here. He had found him. The past was not a ghost rattling the door. It had kicked the door down and was standing in his house. Clara watched him ride in after midnight, a silhouette against a moonless sky. The way he dismounted, the tension in his shoulders, the grim set of his jaw. It was a different man from the one who had left that morning. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a hunter who had seen his prey. He stalked past her into the house without a word, heading straight for the whiskey bottle. He poured a glass, his hand shaking slightly, and downed it in one swallow. "Did you find them?" she asked softly from the doorway. He stared into the empty glass, his back to her. "Yes. What are you going to do?" He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. It was a bleak, haunted landscape of fury and despair. "I'm going to end this," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was no longer just protecting his home. He was preparing for a war. He thought he had escaped a war that had followed him into the heart of his sanctuary. And for the first time, Clara felt a deep, chilling fear, not of the men outside, but for the man standing before her, and the darkness he was about to unleash. A fragile truce settled over the ranch, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Elias became a different man. The withdrawn rancher was replaced by the vigilant marshal. He moved with a coiled intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He spent hours cleaning his weapons, the methodical click-clack of metal on metal, a constant unnerving sound in the quiet house. He began to subtly fortify the ranch, boarding up a back window, reinforcing the stable doors, creating strategic sightlines from the porch to the creek. Clara watched him, her fear mingling with a reluctant admiration. She saw the mind of a strategist at work, and she understood that the shell of Jacob Turner was cracking, revealing the formidable man beneath. She decided she could not be a passive observer. While Elias prepared for a fight, she would search for an answer. "I need to go to town for supplies," she announced one morning, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Flour, salt, and Lily's cough is getting worse. I need horehound candy." Elias looked up from the rifle he was oiling, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "It's not safe. It's less safe to be trapped here with no medicine and dwindling food," she countered. "Jed can drive me. We'll be back before nightfall." He finally relented, his jaw tight. "Stay on the main road. Don't talk to anyone you don't have to." In Bitter Creek, while Jed loaded the wagon, Clara made her way to the small office that housed the **Wyoming Gazette**. The editor was a wiry man with an ink-stained collar named Abernathy. "I'm researching some local history," Clara said, offering a disarming smile. For the child I tutor. She's interested in the founding families of the territory. The Kanes, for instance. They seem to own quite a bit of land around here." Abernathy grunted, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "The Kanes are old money from back east. Bought up railroad land cheap 20 years ago. The old man was a tyrant. Had 2 sons, William and Silas. William was the heir. Wild, but folks said he had a good heart. Silas was the younger one. Clever, quiet. Went to a fancy college." Was Clara picked up on the past tense. "William got himself killed about 5 years back," Abernathy said, lowering his voice. "Got caught in the crossfire between a U.S. Marshal and some outlaws. Tragic business. The Marshal was cleared, of course, man named Vance, tough as they come. But he quit right after. Dropped off the face of the earth. Silas inherited everything. Been expanding the empire ever since. Runs it with an iron fist, they say." Clara's heart began to beat faster. A marshal named Vance. Elias Vance. "A legend in his day," Abernathy said, warming to his topic. He pulled a heavy leather-bound volume from a shelf. "Let's see. Here it is." He opened the book of back issues, his finger tracing a headline from 5 years ago. Asterisk, land heir killed in dispute. Marshal Vance, exonerated asterisk. She scanned the article. It detailed the death of William Kane during a chaotic shootout. It mentioned a surviving brother, Silas. It mentioned the marshal's resignation due to what sources called personal tragedy. It was all there, a constellation of facts that drew a terrifying picture. Jacob Turner was Elias Vance, and Silas Kane was the brother of the man he'd been involved in killing. Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. This wasn't about water rights. This was a vendetta. She thanked Abernathy, her mind reeling, and hurried back to the wagon. The entire ride back to the ranch, she felt the weight of the secret, a cold stone in her stomach. How could she tell him? How could she tell this broken man that the ghost he was fighting was not just a greedy rancher, but a specter from the one event that had shattered his entire world? That night, the attack came. It wasn't a direct assault. It was cruel, calculated. A fire set in the hay barn. The flames lit up the night sky, a roaring orange beacon of Kane's hatred. Elias and the hands fought it desperately, a losing battle against the wind-whipped inferno. They managed to save the horses, but the barn, their winter supply of feed and years of hard work, turned to ash. As the last embers died down, Elias stood in the smoldering ruins. The acrid smoke stung his eyes, but his gaze was fixed on something in the dirt, illuminated by the hellish glow. It was a silver flask, somehow untouched by the flames. He bent and picked it up. It was engraved with a set of intricate initials, BUWK. It was William Kane's flask. He remembered it from the saloon the night before the shooting, the way the young man had polished it on his sleeve. This was not a clue. It was a message, a declaration. Silas Kane knew exactly who he was. Clara came to stand beside him, the heat from the wreckage warming her face. "Elias," she said the name, leaving her lips for the first time. It was not a question. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the flask in his hand, his knuckles white. The truth, which he had tried to outrun for 5 years, had finally cornered him in a field of ash. "He knows," Elias said, his voice hollow. He finally turned to face her, his eyes stripped of all pretense. The weary rancher and the haunted marshal were gone. All that was left was a man staring into the abyss of his past. "He knows who I am. This is revenge." For his brother, Clara reached out and laid a hand on his arm, her touch a small anchor in the swirling chaos. "Then we face him together," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "In the face of his utter desolation, she had found her own strength. She was no longer just the cook. She was a partner in his war. The war escalated. Cain's tactics grew bolder, more personal. A small herd of their best cattle was not rustled, but slaughtered in a distant pasture left for the coyotes. A section of fence along the creek was torn down, allowing their remaining stock to wander into the unforgiving Badlands. Each act was designed to bleed them dry, to isolate them, to break their spirit. But it had the opposite effect. The shared threat forged a bond between the inhabitants of the ranch. Jed and Ben, once simple employees, became loyal soldiers in Elias's quiet army, and at the center of it all were Elias and Clara. The walls between them had crumbled in the ashes of the barn. He began to talk to her, not just about strategy, but about the past. He told her about Sarah, his wife, about the random, senseless violence that had taken her. And he told her about William Cain, how the young man had been caught in the crossfire, a casualty of justice gone wrong. I never saw the shot that killed him. Elias confessed one night, staring into the fire. It was chaos. But it happened on my watch, under my authority. His death is on my hands. Clara listened, her heart aching for the burden he carried. You can't know that, Elias. Abernathy's article said it was a chaotic shootout. It could have been anyone's bullet. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice flat. Silas believes it was mine. And that's all that matters now. Their conversations were a balm on his wounded soul. And he found himself relying on her quiet strength, her clear-eyed pragmatism. She became his counsel, his confidant. He started to see her not as a reminder of his needs, but as a partner who fulfilled them without him ever having to ask. He watched her with Lily, her patience and love, a constant gentle light in the growing darkness, and he felt a protective instinct so fierce it terrified him. He was starting to care, and caring was a liability he couldn't afford. Cain made his next move, and it was the cruelest yet. Young Ben had ridden out to check the fence line along the northern ridge. He didn't return by nightfall. The next morning, his horse trotted back to the ranch alone, its saddle empty. Tied to the saddle horn was a blood-stained piece of Ben's shirt. Jed's face went pale. It's a trap, boss. They've got the boy. They want you to come for him. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury. He knew Jed was right. This was a classic ambush. Cain was trying to draw him out, to get him on open ground, away from the defensible position of the ranch. He was using the life of a good young man as bait. I'm going after him, Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. It's what he wants, Jed protested. You'll be riding straight into his guns. And if I don't go, Ben dies. Elias countered, his jaw set like granite. He's torturing him, Jed. That's the message. He'll send him back to us a piece at a time. That evening, as Elias prepared his gear, checking every weapon, stocking ammunition with grim efficiency, Clara came to him in the barn. You have a plan, she stated. It wasn't a question. They'll be waiting at Devil's Pass, he said, laying out a map on a crate. It's the only direct route to the North Ridge. High ground on both sides. A perfect kill box. So you won't go through the pass. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. There's another way. An old mining trail barely on any map. It's treacherous, but it comes up behind the pass. I can get the drop on them. You'll need a distraction. She said, her mind working as quickly as his. Something to draw their attention to the front of the pass, while you circle around. He was about to argue to tell her to stay out of it, but he stopped. He saw the intelligence and resolve in her eyes. She was right. A riderless horse sent running into the pass at dusk. They'll think it's me, spooked and trying to flee. It'll buy me time. Jed can do that, she said. But you'll still be one man against how many? It's my only chance, he said. No, she said softly. You think you have to do this alone? To atone. But you don't. Let me help you." She paused, then took a steadying breath. "When I went to town, I found something in Elias Vance's old desk. The one in the study you never use. It was a lie, but a necessary one to protect her methods. There was a hidden compartment, a file from your last case." She pulled a small folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was a copy she had painstakingly made of a letter she'd found in the newspaper archives, attributed to a source close to William Kane. It's a letter. From William, written to a friend a week before he died. He says he was afraid of his brother. He says Silas was pressuring him to sign over his inheritance, that Silas had a temper, that he feared for his life. Elias took the paper, his hands trembling as he read the words. The world shifted on its axis. All these years he had carried the guilt of an accidental killing. But this letter painted a much darker picture. A motive, an opportunity, a ruthless brother who stood to gain everything. He could have... Elias whispered the thought too monstrous to complete. He could have used the chaos of your raid as cover, Clara finished for him. To kill his own brother and frame you for it. To make you the perfect scapegoat, a haunted marshal who would simply disappear. The knowledge didn't absolve him, not yet. But it gave him something he hadn't had in 5 years' clarity. He was no longer fighting for redemption against a ghost of his own making. He was fighting for justice against a monster. He looked at Clara, her face illuminated by the single lantern, and for the first time he let her see past the guilt and the grief to the man beneath. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm enveloping hers. It wasn't a gesture of romance, but of profound, elemental gratitude. It was the handshake of 2 soldiers before the final battle. "Now let's go get our boy back." The sky was the color of a fresh bruise as Elias scaled the treacherous mining trail. The wind clawed at him, a physical force trying to tear him from the rock face. Below in the growing darkness, he could see the mouth of Devil's Pass. As planned, Ed released the riderless horse. It galloped into the pass, its panicked whinnies echoing off the canyon walls. Elias saw the muzzle flashes from above as Kane's men opened fire on the decoy. The distraction was working. He crested the ridge behind their position, moving with the silence of a mountain cat. There were 4 of them dug in behind a line of rocks, their attention focused on the pass below. Ben was tied to a tree, his face bruised and swollen, but alive. A cold, precise rage settled over Elias. He raised his rifle, the stock cool and firm against his cheek. He was a marshal again, a purveyor of a harsh and final justice. The first shot took out the guard furthest to the left. The second, a man reloading. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. Elias was already moving, flanking them, using the terrain, his movements a deadly ballet. He had perfected over 100 such encounters. He was not Jacob Turner, the grieving rancher. He was Elias Vance, and he was in his element. The fight was short and brutal. When it was over, 4 men lay still amongst the rocks. Elias cut Ben free, helping the battered young man to his feet. "They never saw you coming, boss." Ben croaked, his voice raw. It was like a ghost. "Let's get you home." Elias said, his voice devoid of triumph. This was not a victory. It was merely a reprieve. He had won the battle, but he knew Silas Kane was the kind of man who would not rest until he had burned Elias's entire world to the ground. As they rode back under a sky now thick with gathering storm clouds, Elias knew the final confrontation was coming. And it would come to his home. The blizzard arrived like an invading army, a wall of white that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world. The wind screamed a banshee's howl that rattled the very bones of the house. Inside, the lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Elias, Clara, Jed, and a recovering Ben were trapped, isolated from the world. It was the perfect stage for a final act. They came near midnight, not with a rush, but with a chilling subtlety. The first sign was the sound of a window pane shattering in an upstairs bedroom and the noise almost lost in the roar of the wind. Then another. They were inside. "Clara, take Lily to the root cellar," Elias ordered, his voice low and urgent as he grabbed his rifle. "Jed, Ben, barricade the stairs. They'll try to come from above." Clara didn't argue. She scooped up a sleepy Lily and carried her down the narrow steps to the cold, dark cellar, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. "It's just a game, sweetie. A hiding game." Upstairs, the fight began. It was a claustrophobic, brutal affair. Kane's men were professionals, moving through the darkened house with deadly intent. Elias used his knowledge of every creak in the floorboards, every shadow to his advantage. A muzzle flash from the parlor, Elias fired back into the darkness, a grunt of pain, his reward. The house became a maze of death, the blizzard raging outside a fitting soundtrack to the chaos within. During a tense lull in the fighting, a voice echoed from the top of the stairs, amplified by the storm. It was eloquent, cultured, and dripping with venom. "Vance, I know you're down there hiding like the coward you are. Did you really think you could disappear? Did you think I would forget what you took from me?" It was Silas Kane. "My brother was weak, it's true." Kane's voice continued a chilling monologue in the heart of the storm. "But he was my blood. You, a common thug with a badge, executed him for sport. You destroyed my family. You cost me everything. And for that, you will watch everything you love turn to ash." As if on cue, an overturned lantern in the library ignited a set of dry curtains. Flames licked up the wall of the orange glow, casting a hellish light through the house. Smoke began to fill the air. The fire was a ticking clock. Down in the root cellar, Clara heard Kane's words. "Asterisk, you destroyed my family." They echoed the letter she had found William's fear of his own brother. An idea desperate and dangerous took root in her mind. Elias was fighting from a place of guilt, believing himself at least partially responsible. But if he knew the whole truth— She looked at Lily, huddled in a corner. "Stay here. Do not make a sound." Clara crept up the cellar stairs. The main floor was a war zone. She needed to get to the study, to the file Elias kept from his martial days. It was a long shot, but it might contain more than just William's letter. It might contain the official report, witness statements, the proof. She moved like a wraith along the wall, smoke stinging her eyes. She slipped into the study as gunfire erupted from the other end of the house. Frantically, she pulled at the drawers of Elias's old desk. Locked. She grabbed a heavy letter opener and pried at the lock, the wood splintering. Inside, beneath a stack of old warrants, was a thick file marked Asterisk, Kane, William Asterisk. She tore it open. Her eyes scanned the pages of Elias's neat, precise script. The official report. And then she found it. A sworn deposition from a stable hand who had worked on the Kane ranch. He testified that on the day of the shooting, he had seen Silas and William arguing violently. He'd heard Silas scream, "Asterisk, the inheritance will be mine, one way or another, asterisk." He'd seen Silas ride out after William, his face a mask of rage, not 20 minutes before the U.S. Marshal's posse arrived. The witness had been paid to leave the territory the next day. He had disappeared. This was it. The proof. Silas hadn't just used the shootout as cover. He had instigated it. He had chased his brother into the path of the law, knowing exactly what would happen. Clara clutched the document and ran from the study back into the heart of the fight. She saw Elias pinned down behind an overturned sofa, the fire now spreading across the ceiling beams. "Elias," she screamed over the roar of the flames and the gunfire. He glanced back, his face grimed with soot. "Get back down there." "No, you have to see this." She scrambled toward him, keeping low the paper held out in her hand. "He didn't just let his brother die, Elias. He murdered him. He set it all up." Elias snatched the deposition, his eyes scanning the words in the flickering firelight. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The guilt he had carried for 5 years, a crushing, soul-destroying weight, evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, righteous fury. He was not a killer haunted by a mistake. He was an instrument of justice who had been framed by a monster. He looked up from the paper, his eyes finding Silas Kane standing on the landing, his elegant duster singed a cruel smile on his face. The smile faltered as he saw the look in Elias's eyes. It was not the look of a broken man. It was the look of a reckoning. "It's over," Cain Elias's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. Your witness talked. He rose from behind the sofa, no longer fighting defensively, but advancing. He moved through the smoke and fire, a figure of pure, relentless purpose. The final confrontation had begun, not for revenge, but for a justice long overdue. The final fight was not a protracted gun battle, but a collision of two opposing forces. Elias, fueled by the liberating power of the truth, moved through the burning room with a singular focus. He disabled Cain's last remaining gunman with a shot to the leg, then advanced on the man who had haunted his life for 5 years. Silas Kane, stripped of his men, and his narrative was just a man. He fired wildly, his aristocratic composure shattered. Elias moved with an almost supernatural calm, closing the distance, the bullets tearing through the air around him. He didn't fire back. Killing Cain would be an act of vengeance, a descent to his level. This was about justice. He slammed into Cain, the force of the impact sending both men crashing through the weakened railing of the staircase to the floor below. They landed in a heap of splintered wood and choking dust. Elias was on his feet first. He wrenched the pistol from Cain's hand and delivered a single precise blow that rendered him unconscious. The roar of the fire was now deafening. A massive ceiling beam engulfed in flames groaned and then crashed down, sealing off the front of the house. They were trapped. "This way," Jed yelled, appearing from the back hallway. "The storm broke a cellar window. We can get out through there." Elias hauled the unconscious Silas Kane over his shoulder. Jed and Ben fought their way through the smoke to the kitchen. Clara was already there, pulling a terrified but unharmed Lily from the root cellar. Together, they squeezed through the narrow cellar opening into the pre-dawn air. The blizzard had broken, the wind had died, and the world was cloaked in a pristine, silent blanket of white. They stood together, watching the home they had built burn against the pale morning sky, the smoke a dark plume of memory and release. As the sun crested the horizon, a posse from Bitter Creek arrived. Ben had slipped out during the siege, a desperate gamble that had paid off. The sheriff, a man whose courage had been bolstered by the sheer scale of Cain's attack, took a defeated Silas and his men into custody. The deposition Clara had found was an ironclad case. The reign of Silas Kane was over. Elias stood before the sheriff, the deposition in his hand. "My name is Elias Vance," he said, the words feeling foreign and yet profoundly right. "And I have a statement to make." In the aftermath, as they tended to their wounds amidst the wreckage, a new quiet settled over them. It was not the silence of grief or isolation, but of exhaustion and peace. Lily, safe in Clara's arms, had fallen asleep. Elias looked at them, his heart aching with a fierce protective love. The storm, both outside and within, was finally over. Months later, spring had laid a carpet of green over the valley. The ranch was being rebuilt, not as a fortress, but as a home. The community, learning the truth of the quiet rancher who was once a legendary marshal, had rallied around them, bringing lumber food and helping hands. Elias Vance, his name cleared and his past reconciled, was no longer a ghost. One warm afternoon, he stood on the porch of the new half-finished house. He held a small wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was his old U.S. Marshal badge and Sarah's silver locket. For years they had been symbols of his failure and his grief. Now they were just memories, parts of a life that had led him here. Clara came to stand beside him. He looked at the objects one last time, then closed the lid. He handed the box to her. For safekeeping, he set his voice quiet. She took it, her hand covering his for a moment. She understood. He wasn't erasing his past. He was entrusting it to their future. He was finally free. He turned and lifted Lily onto his broad shoulders. She giggled, her small hands tangling in his hair. Together, the three of them looked out at their land, at the Sweetwater Creek, glittering in the sun, at a future that stretched before them, bright and full of promise. Clara laid a hand on her stomach, a small secret smile gracing her lips. "Elias," she said softly, "it seems this house is going to need another room soon." He looked at her, his eyes widening in stunned comprehension, then breaking into a smile so full of light and joy it seemed to erase the last 5 years of shadows. He reached out, pulling her close, and rested his forehead against hers. Laughter, genuine and unrestrained, echoed across the valley. The cycle of grief and death was broken, replaced by the promise of new life.